Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to the second of two programs that will launch our fourth season. Polaris Live seeks to understand from multiple perspectives and through the eyes of experts from around the world reasons for the dangerous, daggers-drawn status of the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the US and China. It is our objective to try and improve mutual understanding between the two superpowers and attempt to find practical ways to reduce tensions. Polaris Live is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. As a reminder, PolarisLive.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletters at Kashmeri.com. My guest today is Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar. Dr. Anwar straddles the world of academia, political activism, and government. She's a research professor at Indonesia's Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency. She's written widely on Indonesia's foreign policy and democratization, as well as on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. She was Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs, then Deputy for Government Policy Support to the Vice President of the Republic of Indonesia. We are indeed privileged to have with us again Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar. Please welcome. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Polaris Live, Professor Anwar. Thank you for helping us start our fourth year.
Alaikum assalam. It's good to be back.
So, Dr. Anwar, as you know, our focus is US-China relationship and its impact on the world. Why do you think it is that this relationship between two nuclear superpowers that are the largest economies in the world has not improved over the last 3 years? If anything, it's gotten worse. Can you help us make sense of this?
Well, I think there are many reasons for that. Started, of course, with under the Trump administration that really carried out a trade war against China, and the expectations that the Biden administrations would have a very substantially different policy towards China has not really borne out. That's from the US side. There are concerns, continuing hardline policy from the US side. I don't think that there's any duff from the US side when it comes to China now. It's about being critical of China or being very critical of China.
Right.
And I think that's because there's a perception that, and I think this born also by the reality that China in the past decade under President Xi Jinping has also been very hawkish. It's tried to project its influence and power throughout the world. And it's very assertive, the Chinese economic statecraft using the immense wealth, the immense revenues that China has now to really spread this influence through investment in various countries from Asia to Africa to Latin America to Europe. And China is not shy to use, strong arm tactics to other countries, and its behavior, particularly in the maritime areas in East Asia, South China Sea, East China Sea, have been extremely assertive. And when it comes to the US and China, for a long time, the US has had this complaint. US has been a country that really brought China into the international community. The US supported China into the World Trade Organization, giving it most favorable status, allowing Chinese imports into the US. But then, after a while, the US has lost the competitiveness, and the trade deficit between the two countries just got wider and wider. And then complaints about the violations of copyrights from China, particularly on more sensitive issues. So there are so many different areas where both geopolitics, geoeconomics, securities, have all come together. And of course, in the global arena, we have seen that China is now also flexing its muscle. It's not just a regional power anymore. It's a global power. As it's expanded its economic interest, and also by that also its political interest to the Middle East. And it's on the Russian-Ukraine war, for example, and China is having close relations with Russia. So there are so many conflicting interests between the two superpowers. But I think the most important still is on the economic and technological issues.
Right.
Yeah.
It's, do you think that this cleavage is permanent, given the basic internal makeup of the two countries? And here, Devi, I'm thinking about a liberal democracy on one side and a socialist authoritarian government on the other, and also America looks at itself as a missionary power, that America would like to have its liberal ideas spread out around the world. And as I understand it, perhaps you can correct me, that China really does not have that missionary zeal to conquer the world or have its way of governance spread into the world. Do you think this is just a permanent cleavage that both countries will have to live with each other?
Well, the difference between the current superpower conflict is less ideological than compared to the Cold War, where it was really the issues were ideological: communism versus democracies, communist economy versus free market economy, and so on. The current confrontation between China and the US is less about ideologies and more about other interests, about the incumbent superpower facing an ascendant superpower, where, according to the old theory of Thucydides' trap, that conflicts are often very difficult to avoid. But of course, values are important in international relations. It's difficult for countries that have very different values. In this case, China's closed society and its political system, which is non-democratic, with the US, which is an open liberal democracy where individualism is very important, while China is always a stress on communalism, communitarian values, and so on. But I think that there are. I don't see that while they probably they cannot be very close friends because of these differences. I don't think that it has to be permanent cleavage in the sense that they have to have confrontation all the time. There should be areas of common interest also, where China is a very old civilization. The world has learned a lot from China. China has contributed a lot to the world development, while the United States is a great country coming from great Western civilization, which has also contributed a lot to the world. And the rest of the international community do look up at these countries and do not see them as zero-sum games. Each country has a lot to contribute, and I think that they can learn mutual respect and peaceful coexistence despite all the differences.
And of course, Indonesia, is the largest country in South Asia, and seems to coexist rather well next to this behemoth China. I mean, what is it the U.S. needs to better understand about China, and vice versa, you think?
Well, Indonesia has had its, the rest of Southeast Asia has had difficult relations with China. We have lived with China for millennia, and we've lived with India for millennia. The difference is that you might say that China does not colonize, but historically, China did not have an experience of symmetrical relationship. Historically, China saw itself as a middle kingdom.
Yes,
and it would only relate with the rest of the world on a very unequal footing. China would be willing to trade and in fact give lots of presents, Chinese silk, Chinese porcelains, and they're willing to be very generous to their neighboring countries and so on conditions that you pay tribute to China. So this is this asymmetrical relationship. So
Right.
For that, China has a lot of problems relating to Southeast Asia, which historically it saw as many of South Asian kingdoms in the old days had to pay tribute to China in order to trade. In the old days, they were willing to do that. There were no concepts as Westphalian nation state were equal sovereignty. So we had our problems with China, and we could. And in fact, Indonesia, as you know, we developed very close diplomatic relations with China throughout the 1950s until mid-60s under President Sukarno, because colonialism was considered to be the common enemy. But after that, when Indonesia had a very anti-communist regime, we froze diplomatic relations with China. It's only now in the past decade, 2 decades or 3 decades, starting in 1990, that relations have developed again with China, primarily not because we share common values with China. Indonesia is a Muslim majority country. Communism is still considered to be anathema. It's still forbidden in Indonesia because it's synonymous with atheism, of ungodliness. So there's never going to be any common values there. And also we are also becoming a pluralistic democracy, the third largest democracy in the world. So there's also a very different political system there. But for pragmatic reasons, China is now Indonesia's largest trading partner. China is now Indonesia's second largest investor in the country. Particularly during President Jokowi's administration, the investment in infrastructure is really very important to this government, and the one that is most willing to invest in a lot of the very ambitious infrastructure projects is China. Not just China, of course, Japan and so on. But China has been very willing, so very pragmatic. So in this sense, when you're asking, is there room for developing close relations with the US, despite the different values and political systems and so on, it's there are a lot of real converging interests at the transnational level. We are all faced with climate change issues. We all have to grapple with the issues of energy transition. We all have to grapple with food security, energy security, with maritime security. I'm sure China's trade. China is a trading nation. China is not going to be happy with what's happening in the Red Sea, with Houthis shooting down, containers. So I don't see any reason why all these trading nations should not work together to ensure maritime security, for example. It's just about political will, rather than fundamental obstacles.
Right. But you also seem to be saying a moment ago, if I understand it correctly, that part of this is just two civilizations, one rising and the other one watching this, coming together, and the tension between that, right? So do you think that both countries understand that, or do you think that one side, China, is convinced that America will not want it to rise, and America is convinced that China wants to be a global power, even though there's nothing in China's history? Do you think there's some basic skeletons here that we need to think about?
Well, Sarwar, I'm not sure to what extent history can really tell us about about China's current behavior, because we do not really understand the new China very well. There are not that many experts on the thinking, the Chinese Communist Party, and about the current leaders and so on. So, according to Graham Allison, countries incumbent power and ascending power in the past have tended to do confrontations with each other, so that is conflict inevitable. But I would argue that the current situation does not have to see the conflict, the clash between the US and China to be inevitable. There are many areas of converging interests. So as I say, it's not absolute confrontations like during the Cold War period, where the the economic interests were really very different. There were very few areas of interface. So yeah, the competition will always be there. Rising powers, incumbent powers will always be in competition, even if they have the same values. I mean, just look at Europe. In Europe, World War I, World War II, all of those wars were between countries basically, the same civilizations. The First World War was between cousins, the old grandchildren of Queen Victoria, the British king
Yes.
and the German Kaiser, So, but it is, competition between powers, and I think that we, while calling on the superpowers to find ways and means to deal with certain areas of differences and isolate them, so that they do not really become true impediments, for other areas of cooperation, which is absolutely necessary. For example, on pandemic, we need all countries to get together.
Indeed.
Yeah, on the climate change issue, all countries need to be on the same page, because this is a global, global issue. There's questions about humanity.
Yes.
And in the past, and I don't think we can we can simply forget about the danger of terrorism. If we do not solve the Gaza crisis moment, my concern is that it could also become another focal point for a new age of terrorism, global terrorism round.
Yes.
And we all are in the same boat. And the issues of forced migrations, there's so many people who are in distress moving around the world. And now countries are facing them individually, putting up walls. But we are talking about human beings, who are there. What are we going to do then? This also needs cooperation between countries, between security and humanity. And regardless of your political system, you need to deal with this kind of problems together.
So, Devi, let me please take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel, and you can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and also our newsletters at kashmeri.com. And now back to Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar. I want to follow up a little bit on something you said, Dewi, which is that when India's foreign minister, I'm tangenting a bit, but continuing on, when India's foreign minister was asked by reporters in Europe why India was sitting on a fence regarding the Ukraine-Russia war, why wasn't it taking sides? He replied that it wasn't sitting on the fence, it was standing its ground, meaning, I think, looking after his country's national interests. So what is Indonesia's position on that conflict? Is it fairly similar to where India comes out?
To a certain, yes, but Indonesia voted with the UN on condemning Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, which India abstained. India abstained on that, and then also on the resolutions on that referendum that was carried out unilaterally by Russia and annexing, areas of Ukraine. Indonesia also joined the international community in condemning that. But at the same time, Indonesia did not join and has not joined the UN the sanctions against Russia, and here it is similar in the US because in terms of immediate interests, Indonesia continues to trade with Russia. It imports a lot of raw materials for fertilizers from Russia, which is it's the largest market. At the same time, Indonesia, with its non-aligned foreign policy, free and active foreign policy, also tries to reach out to both sides. I remember during the G20 presidency, the Indonesian President Joko Widodo, visited both Kiev and Moscow and invited both leaders to join the G20. Of course, Putin did not come, but the Russian Prime Minister did come. So Indonesia refused the pressures from some members of the G20 who said that Russia should be disinvited. Indonesia refused to do that. They said the G20 is mostly about economics, and the G20 needs to meet and decide on matters that are of importance to the rest of the international community, that also include Russia. But Zelensky was given the floor. He attended the meeting online. So in this sense, while India abstained on both votes, for Indonesia, it supported the UN because it's about values. It's about violations of the UN Charter, where one country invading a sovereign country. That's really a real violation of the UN Charter. And also annexing provinces. There's also a violations of the Charter about territorial integrity. Indonesia is very sensitive about violation of sovereignty and also the keeping the territorial integrity intact. Yeah. So you see a mix between idealism, principled stance there, but also pragmatism when you need to trade and also to ensure our free and active foreign policy.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the China-US relationship and ask for your opinion on Australia and China. 3 years ago, Australia and China had this huge tiff and they stopped trading with one another, and it was almost as though it's irreparable. But here we are 3 years later, where they've made up, and the big trading relationship seems to be back on track. Leaders are visiting each other. So they were able to overcome a very serious chasm. My question to you is, do you think China and America can learn something from the Australia-China experience in making up? What was there that, is there anything we can learn?
Yes, I mean, it's politics. A change of government in Australia, it's less ideological, probably. The Labour government in Australia has always emphasized its relations with its neighbours in Asia. It has a track record of always being much more constructive in its relations with Asia, putting Australia as part of the geopolitical construct of Asia, and relations with China, whether you like it or not, is one of the most consequential relations. Before the bad relations between Australia and China, is of course, Australia had developed maybe too close a relation with China, becoming too open and too dependent on China, including, in its domestic politics, where China was accused of intervening in Australian domestic politics, including, in fact, intervening in Australian universities, because a lot of Australian universities took up a lot of fee-paying Chinese students, that some universities became very dependent on this, and that allowed China to use pressure when they didn't like the policies of the government or the universities or critical China. It has been known, that the interventions from China, and I think that's a lesson learned, that when we develop relations with any country, particularly great power, do not allow yourself to become too dependent, that you are actually vulnerable to external interventions. But we know that Australia needs to trade with China, as China is one of its largest market, and China also needs Australia. It imports a lot of its energy from Australia. So there are mutual interests here, and I think it's very good that the Albanese government has delivered amidst campaign promises, among others, of trying to repair relations with China. But I'm sure that Australia will also be much more cautious about how far it goes. So not allowing itself again to be vulnerable to external pressures.
And I was particularly thinking before this, I asked you this question, that America and China seem to be, in a much larger way, of course, in the same kind of a relationship, which is a backlash that we are seeing in America right now. So maybe that has to take its time in resolving itself. But that's a very interesting analysis that you've given us. Now I'm going to ask you about this. There's a lot of talk, headlines about the changing world order, that we're moving from a US dominated unipolar moment to a China US bilateral two power world, to now the global south with all of these countries that are increasing in wealth and influence. Are you pretty much convinced that we have moved now beyond the Second World War, America West dominated order, and from now on it's going to be a much wider playing field and different ways of handling relationships?
Well, it's a much more complex and interesting world. International relations experts debate whether it's by a new emergence of bipolarity, whether it's multipolarity, or whether it's multiplexity. I think all of the above. When it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about in the security domain, military domains, it's still a unipolar world. The China is not in a position to be a global policeman yet, sending its troops overseas, involving in so many different areas of conflicts. China is not there yet. So the US is still the single most powerful military power. Its military budget is still way above the sum of the budgets of, some of the bigger economies.
Indeed.
And it is, by far, it is still the only country that is able to send its armada to different parts of the globe. So when you're talking about security, it is still pretty unipolar. China is not there. Russia is not there. When it's coming to economy, it's clearly multipolar. China is the largest economy. The US is the second largest economy. But you look at the G20 countries. India is there. Japan is there. There's, so many new emerging economies. Brazil, Indonesia is slowly going up. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So there are many countries which are now very important in the economy. And we are not just talking about countries, regional organizations. When you're talking about economy, you cannot ignore the EU. And ASEAN, it's a substantial economy as well. So when you have a lot of free trade arrangements, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which comprise the 10 ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, but minus India. India opted out. It's
Right.
the largest trading bloc, free trade bloc that's coming. So that's another one. So it's much more multipolar. But don't forget, international relations are not just driven by countries or even by state-driven regional organizations. We have non-state actors. For a long time, our books have talked about the power of MNCs, multinational companies, are even more powerful. They're even more wealthy than a number of countries. The MNCs, oil companies are now digital companies. The high net worth individuals, the Bill Gates, the Meta, the Tesla, and so on. They're extremely powerful. They're consequential. They make policies. The Googles, Amazon. They're truly global. There are very few places in the world where they do not have their presence, and some they're more powerful than government. Government find it difficult to regulate them. And then don't forget, you have terrorists. One terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda changed the world.
Indeed.
How we look at security. And that, Amitav Acharya talk about, we are not looking at the multipolar world, but, to a multiplex world where there are multiple actors, both state and non-state actors. There are also multiple issues. So in the past, when you're talking about international relations, we're talking about war and peace, then trade, commerce, part of that. But now there are so many other issues. Pandemics becomes an international issue.
Absolutely.
The climate becomes national issues. the movement of people become international issues. So they're much, much, much more complex. So I think you need to be able to differentiate what exactly are you talking about.
But Devi, and we're running out of time, so this might have to be the last question. I had so much to talk to you about, so you're just going to have to come back for a week or so and stay with us. But what I wanted to say was, I mean, it is a complex world. It's a much more complex world than there used to be. But Devi, we have the internet, we have instant communication. In the old days, countries really didn't fully know all about the other country and its trade statistics and what it's doing and its technology. Now everything is open, so you would think that things would be more peaceful. I mean, we know what the other person is doing, right? And so as we say goodbye to you, tell us, why isn't that the case? Is there something in global power politics that remains the same, irrespective of changes in all the technologies and learning?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but there's what they call the information overload and algorithms. There's a lot of information out there, but apparently people only listen to what they like, and they only Google or get information from their social medias on issues that they agree on. So a lot of information does not necessarily translate into more knowledge. And getting closer to each other doesn't really mean that we get to understand each other better. So there is still a role, I think, that for me, more mediated flow of information. The role of the conventional media, the role of conventional educators are still important. Otherwise, we cannot simply let our children simply to learn from YouTubes and so on without, where a lot of the information are not necessarily valid one.
Well, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, we have run out of time, but thank you, Dewi, for taking your time to help us launch Polaris-Live's new session. I'm hoping that we'll be able to focus a lot more than the previous 3 sessions on Africa, opinions from Africa, South Central America, the Caribbean, and Asia. So I hope you will come back and see us again, but thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next program on Polaris Live as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact on the world. Until then, goodbye.